Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Louise. And hello, everyone, and welcome to OTF Connect. Thank you so much for giving of your own time to join us tonight. It's so wonderful to have so many of you here tonight. We've got 34 participants. That's absolutely amazing. And happy to have so many new to OTF Connect. So welcome again. I'm delighted at the number and variety of webinars that we have scheduled for the 2015 Winter-Spring program. We were fortunate to get funding from the ministry to support teachers in the area of mathematics. So we have quite a few math sessions scheduled from now to the beginning of the program will go to the beginning of June. So please do check the calendar at the end of the session and sign up for upcoming sessions, and do share the link with your colleagues. And it's great to see the spread of participants here from across the province, so thank you again. It's my pleasure tonight to welcome Kathy Griffin, who will be facilitating the webinar on Fearless with Fractions. Kathy has a lot of experience in mathematics and so brings much knowledge, experience, and resources to share with us tonight. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you very much, Syria. And it is exciting to see all the spread of where people have come from and the different kinds of teaching assignments or beginning teachers that are here. So I started counting up how many years I've been teaching, and it turns out it's not 12 anymore. It's more like 18. And I've taught in New Zealand, BC, Alberta, and now I'm back near, well, in my hometown in Ontario, in Grey County. And I teach in a very rural school in Grey County, which is about 2 hours north of Toronto. And I've been teaching grade 4 to 7 for the past 8 years or so. And this is currently my first year as a learning resource teacher. But when I came back to Grey County, I started playing around with problem solving in my math classes, and got introduced to the 3-part lesson and open and parallel problems and rich problems. And then 2 years ago, I led a math TLLP, and that's a teacher leadership learning project that's funded by the Ministry of Ontario, the Education, and teachers can get funding to do their own projects through that. So we did that, and that really got me started in working with other teachers. And for the last year and this year, I've been running with some people from the math group and another teacher in Blue Water, Liz Campbell. We've been running the Blue Water Action Research Network, which is kind of like our version of a TLP, where we fund teachers to do their own research on their own practice. So today's session is going to be a mini tour of some of the most important things I've learned in the last 8 years about math, and specifically fractions. So before we get started, I want to check in with you and hear about, incorporate your voice into the session. So I'm wondering if you could either add in the chat box or write on the screen using that text tool why you're here and what you're hoping to learn from the session. And I'm going to turn my mic off and just, if I can remember where the timer is, I'm going to set the timer for about 2 minutes just to let you add.
I'll just jump in and make sure that everyone's finding the text tool okay. If you're using the chat, that's fine as well. The text tool for the whiteboard is the 4th tool from the top of the little strip at the left-hand edge of your tool, of your whiteboard.
So just as people are adding their comments, I'm seeing a lot of common themes pop up, and I chose the title Fearless with Fractions for a reason, and I feel that there is quite a bit of a fear around math, and particularly with fractions. I also very much empathize or sympathize with the feeling that, you know, I myself struggle with some aspects of math or have in the past, and I hear that coming out in people's voices. And I see some questions about strategies and knowledge to do, you know, manipulatives especially, yeah, helping students who are struggling. So there's a lot of common themes here. And I'm going to ask you a little bit more about this idea of fear and fearlessness in a minute. I'm going to go on to the next slide now, so I'm sorry if I'm cutting you off there. And I'm going to go, you can keep talking in the chat box if you like. But before we go on to talk about fear and fearlessness, I just want to kind of outline sort of some of the things for me that I'm passionate about in my own practice, and sort of why I wanted to do this session. First of all, I think that reflection for ourselves in our own practice is really important. And reflection for students and trying to get students to reflect on their own work is really important. I'm also really passionate about including student voice in my teaching and being led by student voice. Action research is a way I've found of moving forward with my practice, of choosing something I'm concerned about, deciding, you can keep writing on the screen if you want, by the way, but choosing something I feel I'm struggling with. And I see that, you know, somebody has just said, Lenore has just said, that the more prepared I can be in the lessons, you know, the better I can do. And sometimes you don't get practice if you're seeing a variety of grade levels. So for me, picking something when there's a plethora of things I want to improve on my practice, it's really important for me to focus, pick something, try and improve it, check and see how I'm doing, and really be focused about it. I'm hoping to give you some jumping off points here tonight. I won't be able to solve all the problems people have with fractions or give you answers to everything, but I'm hoping that I'll spark some ideas in places where you can start changing your own practice or incorporating some new ideas. Speaking of that, I will be providing you with some lists of resources, and Louise is going to help me put some web sites in the chat box for you where you can find more information. And probably most importantly for me is that I present myself as authentic, not as a perfect practitioner, perfect teacher, but somebody who's struggling to improve my own practice. And hopefully by doing that, I'll help make this a safe environment for other people to share as well. So some of you have talked about sort of, you know, struggling with your own understanding of fractions, but I'm just curious as to what your reaction, and you can start adding comments at any time. What's your reaction to the word fearless in the title? And maybe you have a best or worst moment as a teacher or learner with fractions that you want to share. And how's your fear level right now, and why? I know I'll start off with myself right away right now, because this is my first webinar, and so it was a little bit daunting for me to come into this not knowing so much about it. But Louise has really helped in taking me through the process and allowing me to practice, and it also helps that not everybody can see me while you're not all in front of me, so that kind of takes away a bit of the fear. I can just pretend I'm talking to a couple of friends online here. But I'm going to let you go with this, and I'm going to turn off my mic for a minute, and if there's anybody who wants to respond with their microphone, please feel free. again, I'm seeing some common threads here. There's some people who definitely don't equate fear with fractions, and that's wonderful. There's some people that have commented on how fearful their students maybe are of fractions. And someone in one of the boxes said, you know, how to, I'm just trying to find this one, how to wean kids from the, I'm not sure, maybe that's from the manipulatives onto paper, or when they're really just playing and not on task. And there's quite a few people who are saying they aren't fearful themselves right now, which is great. I think there are many of us as teachers who perhaps have been fearful of math as students ourselves, and maybe are seeing how we can allow our students to be more comfortable. Is there anybody who wants to share one of their ideas or elaborate using the microphone? Okay, so I'm going to move the slide on again, and basically what we're going to do now is take a first look at this problem, which is has been written by Kathy Fosno, and there is an online connection you can go to get the whole resource that goes with this field trip problem. And I'm going to read the question, but I'd like you to think about differentiation while you're listening to this problem. How might students at different levels interact with this problem? Is it, you know, we don't ever have kids in grade 5, for example, that are all at grade 5 level. We might have some that are beyond grade 5, working at a grade 6 or 7 level, some kids that maybe are still at grade 3, 2 even. So is this problem accessible to more than one level of student? So the field trip problem, I'll read you the context. A 5th grade class, and you could change that to whatever grade, traveled on a field trip in 4 separate cars. The school provided a lunch of sub-sandwiches for each group. When they stopped for lunch, the subs were cut and shared as follows. So you have the four groups there. So the first group had 4 people and shared 3 subs equally. The second group had 5 people and they shared 4 subs equally. The third group had 8 people and they shared 7 subs equally. And the last group had 5 people and shared 3 subs equally. So when they returned from the field trip, the children began to talk about what they'd had for lunch, and they began to argue that the distribution of the sandwiches had not been fair. Some children got more to eat than others. Were they right? Or did everyone get the same amount? So on the bottom of the question I've put, was this fair? So I'm just wondering right now, if you could just use your checkmark tool, do you see if this question could be done in part or in whole by students, say, from 4 all the way up to 7? So if you think that students from grade 4 to 7, anywhere in there, might be able to do at least part or all of this question, can you use your little check mark to give me a yes symbol? If you kind of question whether it's appropriate for certain grade levels, then you can click on the red X. Okay, so far we've got all green check marks. And what I'm going to take you through next, as everyone finishes doing their tally, is just taking a look actually at the curriculum. And I had a professor in a class that I took, Susan Drake, who took our group through a curriculum sort. So many of you, and Bella, the check mark is just underneath at the top. There's a check, and if you hover over it, there's a green yes and a red no, just above everybody's name that's in the room. But Susan Drake took us through how to do a curriculum sort and take a look at the curriculum, not just for your grade. So, for example, if you're teaching your grade 5 course, maybe taking a look at 2 grades below and 2 or 3 grades above, something like that, just to see where are the kids coming from in what maybe they at that grade below they have learned or should have learned or may have learned for a certain topic. So we're going to take a look at the curriculum, and there's a certain way I want you to kind of interact with I'm just trying to, there we go, with the curriculum. So here's the grade 3 curriculum for fractions, and it's very small. And what I'd like you to do is use your highlighter and highlight in green. And if you don't mind using a lighter color green, just so that we can still read what's underneath, anything that the students have to know. So it might be something they need to know, understand what that thing is before they can actually do something with it. And use a light colored red, if you don't mind, to highlight the do. So I'm just going to go to my highlighter here, and I'm going to pick a green, light green. And I'm going to say something that they need to be able to know is what a whole object is. They have to know, whoops, I'm not on my highlighter. Other people have done it. There you go. You know what you're doing. So as you're going, some of the things that they need to be able to know are what whole objects are and what equal parts are. And they have to know the fractional names, like 1/2, 3/3, 2/4, 2/4, but they do not have to know the standard fractional notation. So even though some of us have highlighted that, this is not an expectation for grade 3. Okay? Yeah, so green is what the students need to know, and red is what they need to be able to do. Okay. Now I'm going to ask Louise, are we able to clear this highlight?
We sure are, and I will do that. And, awesome. And for those of you that are wondering how to change the color of your highlighter, once you've selected your highlighter, look down towards the bottom left of your whiteboard, and you're going to see a little toolbar that's got a colored square. It's usually yellow, that's the default, and when you click on that yellow, you're going to get a whole bunch of color choices to choose from.
So we're going to, in a moment, go on to the grade 4 curriculum. And what I would like you to do is just take a look at what is different from grade 3 to 4. So basically, in grade 3, we're taking a look at kids just being able to separate, sets or objects into parts, equal parts, and that's really important, okay? And be able to name them. So when we take a look at the grade 4, and just take a minute to read this before you highlight. So there's a huge leap in understanding for grade 4. If you haven't taken a good look at the difference between grade 3 and 4, there's a lot they're expected to know in grade 4. And I'm going to get you to highlight again. Now if you can choose a light color to highlight just so we can still read the words, that would be great. So when you go down under your highlighter, and you click on, mine right now say black, and click on a really light color. And again, click on, highlight things that they have to be able to know in green, and then those action words or verbs in red. Okay, so we've got students having to be able to represent fractions now. And they can use concrete materials, words, but that standard notation is added in. I've got somebody who's circled and now highlighted in red the word explain. They have to explain the meaning of denominator and numerator. They have to be able to compare and order fractions. Compare to benchmarks. So if we were highlighting in green some of the things they have to know, one of the things is to know what is a benchmark. So they are going to have to know what is 0, what is half, what is 1, and we're going to take a look at some of those benchmarks in an activity a little later. They have to be able to demonstrate, which is an action word, demonstrate equivalence. So they do need to, that's kind of a double whammy there. They have to be able to do it, demonstrate, and they have to know what equivalence means. And then again, another action word is to count forward by the different fractions. Someone's just underlined the word investigate. So they need to be able to investigate the relationship between fractions and decimals. And that's where that proportional reasoning comes in, which is that ability to kind of go back and forth between different representations. And one of the ways you see the proportional reasoning is to be able to hold in your head sort of what the whole is, as well as what it might be when it's divided into different parts. So knowing that one whole is equal to 2 halves, 4 fourths, those sorts of things. And that's sort of where the proportional reasoning comes in. Okay, we're going to switch to grade 5. Now I'm going to ask you to be a little bit more careful with your highlighting this time. So remember some of the things that grade 4s need to be able to do. What are the new things in grade 5 that students need to be able to do and know? So try and highlight just some of the things that maybe aren't the same as grade 4. Yeah, so definitely proper and improper fractions are different. Mixed numbers is definitely different. That's something they need to be able to know what that is, as well as the proper and improper fractions. They're expected to be able to order all of those, and the things with like denominators. And explain what equivalent fractions are, and describe that multiplicative relationship between quantities using simple fractions and decimals. So the fact that, 3/3 equals a whole, 3 groups. And we've got, again, the relationship between fractions and equivalent decimals that don't worry about the color, that's okay. But that fractional, that was Kristen that said that in the text box. The relationship between fractions and equivalent decimals is very much that proportional reasoning. Okay, so let's take a look at the curriculum at grade 6. And now it comes back down to fewer bullet points, but there's some new terms here. So we've got, somebody's highlighted the unlike denominators. That's new for grade 6. And there's some different tools that are listed as examples. Calculators is definitely in there, and we've got the addition of percents. Yeah. Okay, and finally, let's take a look at what happens when you hit grade 7. So we're going above the junior years here, but any of us that have taught a grade 6, 7 class know that just because you're a junior teacher doesn't mean you get away from teaching grade 7 math. So what is new for the grade 7 group? Right, adding and subtracting fractions. So you've now got some more complicated calculations, perhaps. You've got adding and subtracting fractions with simple, like, and unlike denominators, yes. You've also got the justifying, the most appropriate representation of a quantity. So that means, are they going to use a percent, a decimal, a fraction to represent somebody? They need to be able to justify that. And we've got some additions to the proportional reasoning. So they've got the relationship between fractions, decimals, and now percents and ratios. And tied in with the adding and subtracting of fractions, somebody just highlighted the repeated addition and the multiplication of a fraction by a whole number. So maybe 2, what is 2 times a half? Or if you're multiplying 2 times a half, then you've got that's a half plus a half. Okay, so can I just get, using your tick box here, just want a sense of, is this something that you've done before that's familiar, or is this something that's a bit new to you, going through and doing a fraction, a curriculum sort like this? So if it's new to you, we're hopefully using the green check. If it's something you've done before, then maybe the X. Okay, so we've got quite a split with the group, which is fine. Okay. So as we go into the next slide, we're going to take a look at the problem again, and with the idea in mind that there's quite a difference in the curriculum between grade 3 and grade 7, and you might have in any class you teach quite a variety of ability, I want you to choose a way to answer the question. You might do it just the way you would do it, which is comfortable for you, and I actually want you to solve the problem, or you might kind of interact with it the way you think one of your students might be, maybe a student that's below grade level, at grade level, above grade level. However you like, it's not a problem. So I'm going to read the question again, and then I'm going to change to a screen where you can maybe put some of your thinking up if you want, or you can respond in the text box, or you can just start working on your own piece of paper if you like. So before we get started, I tend to use this problem as a diagnostic tool at the beginning of a unit, so I can really see what my students are thinking about fractions. And then when I'm done a unit, I usually use it again just to see, okay, where are they with their thinking. And I've got a question in the text box. Maybe, yeah, splitting them into groups and having them brainstorm solutions would be good, that sort of thing. And I think the question is from Bella, does this kind of thing prepare you to see and respond to various levels? And I do find it does that. It gets me prepared to see, okay, I might see this different kind of thinking with my students. So the question is, a 5th grade class traveled on a field trip in 4 separate cars. And for the kids, I usually draw the picture of the cars. If there's anybody who's listening and wants to do that, go ahead. But the first car is going to maybe be a regular car. They all have submarine sandwiches for lunch, and they were cut up as follows. So the first group has 4 people sharing 3 subs equally. The second, which is maybe a bit bigger car, has 5 people and shared 4 subs equally. And then maybe it's a minivan, had the third group had 8 people and shared 7 subs equally. And then the last group had 5 people and shared 3 subs equally. And when the kids got back to school again, they started to argue that the distribution of the sandwiches was not fair, that some children got more to eat than others. Were they right, or did everyone get the same amount? So I want you to have a go at the question. And I'm going to flip to the next page where you can still see up at the corner the 4 different vehicles and who was in it and how they shared them. You're welcome to draw some or write some answers, some thinking, some strategies, whatever you like on the white part of this screen, or write some ideas in the text box. But you're also welcome to work on it on a piece of paper. Okay? And I see some discussion about manipulatives and things, and you know, you may not have any at your home or wherever you are, but you can start imagining, and we'll take a look a little bit later, one of the next slides, at what kind of manipulatives you think you might want to have on hand for the kids. I'm just going to turn my microphone off and give you a few minutes to work on the problem. I'm just going to give you another minute or so to finish up your own thinking. Maybe don't worry about if you finish the whole part of your problem, and maybe take a look at some of what the other people have said. Okay, lots of great thinking going on here. So I'm going to ask if I hope I'm not, well, I'm going to put some people on the spot here, and I'm just wondering if Vicki Mason, if you would be able to explain your thinking about why it's not fair, just looking at number 1 and number 4. Would you be able to turn your microphone on and explain that to us? And you can say no if you want. Okay, no microphone. Okay, so Vicki said dividing the whole group into greater numbers of parts means less proportion of sub. So you're talking about 1 and 4 having the same number of subs. So if you are dividing them up into between 4 people or 5 people, it's not going to be fair because there's going to be less sub for the people, the 5 people. Okay. I was actually surprised the first time I had a student that answered just by looking at two of them not doing all the work, and I thought, oh my goodness, why didn't I think of that? Because I had gone, of course, and when I practiced the question myself, I felt I had to do all 4 of them and really, you know, take a look at them and compare them. But that's kind of a way of doing it that really uses your logical reasoning to say you don't have to do all of them. I'm wondering what you think about some of the level of the math that we're using ourselves here. Could you just take a look at some of the math that we've got up here? And maybe you could take just a color or put a tick beside the ones that you think might be grade appropriate, say for the junior years, so 4, 5, and 6, and maybe a question mark besides some of the math that you think maybe is beyond a grade 6 level, that maybe they wouldn't be able to do yet. So I'm just saying if you use a tick mark, yep, for things that you think our grade levels in junior years would be able to do, and maybe a question mark, maybe they wouldn't, most of them wouldn't be there yet. Okay, so definitely when I've done this, and I've done this from grade 4 to grade 7, I do get a high proportion of the kind of answers that where all the green check marks are. And I see that there's a question coming up with the converting of the fractions into decimals. And one thing I want to point out is that this is not the actual changing of the fraction into decimals is not necessarily something that we want the students to do right away. We probably want them to be able to do more of the representing of the fractions first visually and using the concrete materials. I also see some people that have made common denominators, and that's a really good method that a lot of us as adults are really familiar with and maybe most comfortable with. But that's not something really that we start looking at until grade 7 or grade 8. We really want the kids to start to develop an understanding of what the fractions are and what they look like, and to be able to visualize them and compare them logically with their understanding maybe of comparing them to benchmark fractions. So we're gonna come back to the benchmark fractions and the visualization, but it's an interesting activity to try and start to do a math problem and see what would it look like for the kids at different levels. What am I most comfortable with, and then start taking a look at some of the different ways we could encourage our kids to solve the problems. So, excuse me. So I'm going to move the screen to some actual kid work. And this is all available in the Kathy Fosno online resource. So she takes you through a whole lot of, well, a problem, and shows you how the kids might answer the problem, some of the strategies. And then she talks about, okay, well, if they're doing it this way, here's how you might move them to a more sophisticated or the next level of solving the problem. So just take a look at this first one here. So the field trip, Bella just asked what's the resource, and Louise has put the link in again just above your chat entry there. So Kathy Fosno has a website called contextsforlearning.com, and she has some samples available that are free. And I have to admit, I've never actually bought her resources, but I've used the online samples a lot, and they're fabulous. So I think I would recommend the resource, but it's quite expensive. Okay, so this sample, you see some similarities to some of the work we saw of people drawing, and there's a couple of things I want to point out to you. So some of the things, if you're watching what your students are doing, they might, for example, here in this second group here, they might start dividing up their sandwiches using first halves, and many of the students do this, and then when they get to a point where halves aren't going to work anymore. So they got this answer here where they've got a half plus a fifth. So they took this bottom one here and divided it into fifths, and then they got stuck with this extra bit here. And I have many kids who can't, at this point, tell you that each of those pieces is a tenth. They might refer to it as, right here, half of a fifth of a half. So this group here knew that that was a tenth. And there's a lot of teaching, sophisticated teaching about or learning about fractions that needs to be able to go into being able to do that switch from that sub being a whole cut into two halves, but one of those halves is cut into 5 pieces, but those 5 pieces aren't fifths, they're tenths, because if you divide the whole thing up, it would be 10 pieces or 10 tenths. Okay, so I would say more. This would be something maybe a grade 6 or 7 student could do, but more of the grade 4s and 5s are going to have more of the answers like this one here, and they're going to stop short of calling those tenths, and they're going to not really know how to go further with that. Okay. This group also has a really good way that I've seen a couple of groups of students go at it, which is they use cubes, or they use graph cubes like grid paper. And they say all the subs are 20 cubes long or 20 centimeters long. And then when they divide them up, they can tell how long each piece is, and then they can compare them directly. And that's a pretty interesting way of doing it, and it's using a different model. So these models here I would call area models, where you're dividing up and you're looking at how much of the space is a sub. Whereas this one is more, when you're actually getting into centimeters or cubes, it's more of a linear model of comparing fractions. So I like this problem because I can see where the kids are, how are they representing the fractions, where do they get stuck, and then the different groups can help show each other's a way of solving the problem. And teaching the concept of a whole is a precursor, Vicki has said. And sometimes you'll come into hearing them have misconceptions, or they're making mistakes about dividing that up and saying that it's a fifth of a half, and they don't know what the whole is and how to divide it up. So those are some teaching points, or some spots where you can do some investigation. The second example I've got here is a group that was like Vicki and a few others who said automatically that there were maybe two spots you could just compare two of the vehicles and get an answer right away that it's not fair. And Bella, if you go to that link, you can just download it as a PDF, and then you can have the whole resource. She's got other samples up there for different strands of math. And there, I find them to be excellent starting points for ways of teaching fractions. So this group has definitely done a different sort of way of looking at the fraction. And at the start, it looks the same as the first example, but what this group has done is they've said that this is for one person. So this one person gets 3/4. And then the second person would get 3/4, and the third person would get 3/4, and the fourth person would get 3/4 here. Okay? And Louise, if you didn't see the chat there, Louise has said that all the related resources, she's going to post them to a web page that she'll share with you in an email tomorrow. So you don't have to worry about copying them down right now. And the second one here, whoops, this person gets 4/5, and then another person would get 4/5, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a much more sophisticated way of looking at the fractions than just fair sharing, cutting it up and saying one piece for you, one piece for you, one piece for you, and you know, going on that way. So you can kind of see when you start interacting with a resource like this, like she takes you, Kathy Fawson takes you through what you might see in the kids' work and where to go next. And they're awesome resources. And there's a few others I'm going to show you about that are kind of very similar. Okay. I'm just wondering, are there any questions about this right now? I want to emphasize that taking a look at visualizing and representing the fractions is really, 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 really important before you ever go on to doing any sort of changing to common denominators or using some way of changing the fraction. The kids need to know, I'm trying to remember who it was talking about the whole. They need to know what a whole is. They need to know that fractions represent fair sharing. And that was something that was really new to me in fractions. The fact that really a fraction is how you could fairly divide something up into quarters or fifths. And Angela asked, would it be a good EQAO practice question? And I really think it is. I think EQAO is moving more towards questions like this rather than just, you know, quick computational. This requires the kids to, you know, really think about and make a judgment about a fairness or not. Okay, so there's a lot of things that come up when you're working on a problem like this. One of the things that really has been important in my practice is learning how to probe student thinking. And Louise is going to put a resource link up there to one of the ministry, the Literacy and Numeracy Secretariat monographs that takes you through how you can ask students questions to probe their thinking. I've really gotten away from interacting with, or tried to interacting with students and saying, you know, maybe you should try it this way, or giving them the answers. And those questions, like if I were to look at this last slide here and I saw what the kids did, I would be asking them a lot of questions because I don't think they've justified the whole thing. I can see what they've done because I know, maybe have a better background with fractions. But it's not all explained here and there's no answer. So the capacity building series that Louise just put the link to there, yeah, Julie said it's very good resource. It's got a whole bunch of questions, and really I focused on really a main few here. Asking the questions, what are you thinking? What do you think you might do next? For that last group, how have you shown your thinking? Did you get that all down on the page? If somebody reads this work you've done, will they know all of that you just told me? And the last one, you know, how do you know? So Vicki and a few other people said, you know, I know right away that 1 and 4 are not fair. So if a student told me that, I'd be asking them, probing them more, how do you know? Can you show me? And then taking a look at some other things like, what is it related to? Have you done something like this before, maybe in decimals or something else? Okay. Bella's got a good comment there, you know, asking, you know, what do I know? Circling the most important information and questions and those sorts of things. Asking them about strategies. Taking a look at what kind of manipulatives they're using and why. One of the things that I have always stayed away from is the Cuisinart rods. And I, through working with my colleagues, kind of investigated how could I use these and how might they work. And so we trialed them with the students, and I asked them the question, are these useful for you? You know, how do they compare to your use of this other manipulative? Which one is the best? Okay, Melanie has a good question there. Is there another way you could solve this problem? Another one they have in the resource is, you know, how would you explain this if you're going to explain it to somebody in grade 2, so you could simplify your thinking? Another issue that always comes up when you're doing this kind of work, and normally I have my students working in partners or groups of 3, is a whole group work issue. And could you just give me a check here? I'm going to clear the check. How many people struggle with getting their kids to work effectively in groups? Checks for yes. I have trouble. And even though I've worked a lot on group work, it's still one of my main things that I work on with my students. Okay. And I kind of had, when I was working on in the TLP with my colleagues, kind of had an epiphany moment when we were doing this. We were very clear with the kids that we were trying to improve what we were doing, and we were involved in testing some things and seeing how they worked. We asked the kids for their feedback, and by doing that and by making it clear that we were trying to experiment with our own practice, the kids started doing that themselves and started to become part of the action research we were doing. So I had them tell me, you know, what when we're doing a problem works well for you? What are the challenges? And a lot of them said the things like Julie has just said. Often there's ones that take over while others sit back. And changing up groups is often a solution to that. And so with my students, we came up with a whole lot of things that were working well. And then we chose some things that weren't working well. We brainstormed some possible ways of solving the problem. And then we intentionally trialed them. So some of the kids, for example, for group work, felt that they really wanted to work by themselves, but because collaboration was important for learning, they decided they would work alone and then get together and compare and maybe do a joint presentation of their work together. Others like dividing up the roles so that there's somebody who's writing down and that's somebody else that's using the manipulatives. So we trialed a whole bunch of things and then collected sort of data informally. How did it work for you? And this empowered my students to kind of figure out what works best for them and then to use that more regularly. We did have a discussion of things that were unnegotiable, the fact that they did need to collaborate and talk to others about what they were doing. And one of the things that happened to me in the year I was doing this is I went to write their report cards, and I found that because we've been doing so much experimenting with their learning based on what they were doing, the things that they were trialing and their reflections, I couldn't write their learning skills comments. So I was sitting there at my computer and I was trying to write their learning skills comments, and I kept coming up with, you know, that's not right. What's wrong? Why am I having such a problem with this? And I realized it was because they knew where they were and what they needed to do next. And I want to show you a bit of a video of my students at the end of this process, that first term, when they actually told me what the barriers were to their learning, what they needed to work on, and what they were going to do next. So these are the kids these were basically the comments that I put on their learning skills. I actually put quotes in quotation marks what they said were their problems and what they wanted to do next. So I'm going to try and put this link in, and as soon as I start it, it should start on your screen, but I've also put the link. If you can't, you can copy the URL and then see it like in your own web browser, like Internet Explorer. So I'm just going to start this now. You may have to adjust your volume if it's too loud. So I'm hoping that most of you were able to see the video. Those were just a few of my students that I got the permission for to use their videos in some presentations. And they were obviously working in small groups of students. I grouped them to groups of students based on the barriers to learning that they had identified themselves. So I interviewed each of them after we had a discussion about learning skills. And they told me basically what they felt their barriers were to learning and what their strengths were. And then we put those right into their report cards in quotation marks, and they came up with things to work on in the next term. And I'm going to leave this blank screen open for a minute if you want to add any reflections or comments or questions, or you can add them to the chat box, just to do with what we've done so far and questions that you might have. Ferial said that you're surprised how they were so open and honest, and I think a lot of that came from the fact that I was very open and honest with them in the fact that what I really wanted for them in math was for them to enjoy the process and to feel safe and secure and to feel empowered in their own learning, that they could make a difference in what they were doing and how they were progressing. And I was very open and honest about the fact that I wasn't a perfect teacher, and that I felt, you know, that I was trying things to see how it worked. And as soon as they saw that I was experimenting and taking risks, then they felt they could do that as well. And I worry when people are watching the video that you might hear some adult terms like what Angela said with not that you said this, but I'm saying it, knowing what negative self-talk was. And I kind of gave them some vocabulary, but they were able to tell me that something that they kind of worry in their head about things. And the one girl, the blonde girl, that was talking about problems with stress, she came up to me and said, I feel I'm a bad person when I don't do well in my work. And it even takes me aback right now when I'm talking about that, because I don't ever want a student to feel that way in my classroom. And so we had this discussion about what's going on in their head. Yeah, it's upsetting. But this is a student who does very well in school. And that if we hadn't opened up this conversation, she would not have shared that that's how that she feels. She gets B's and A's routinely on her report card, and yet she puts so much pressure on herself. So we were able to talk through what are some strategies that you could use that you'd feel more safe with. And she definitely felt more safe having a chance to discuss her work with someone else before handing it in to a teacher. And we really, thank you, Bella, we really worked on that openness and the mental health strategies, Louise. I'm just going to read your comments here for a minute. I agree with Stephanie there that there are students who don't make good partner choices and maybe always go with their friends. And we were able to really talk about that and maybe say, okay, well, if you want to work with this person, maybe it can't be every day, or maybe you need to use that 2 pieces of paper, 2 heads working on your work, and then compare it. And I agree, Bella, that this is so important for kids to be able to do this. I like Julie's idea there of having students set the term goals and then reassess how they're doing. Really using that student self-evaluation and reflection. And you're right, Bella, it's when they don't talk about things that there's a problem. And if we don't create that open space for it, then they're maybe not going to do it. And I remember, you know, myself as a beginning teacher and teaching in a much different way when I taught math, teaching from the textbook or teaching from the binder that I got from another teacher, and just feeling I had to get through the material and every kid had to do every question on every sheet, and feeling frustrated with the, you know, the kind of things that that we were doing. I noticed the ELL student issue there, that sometimes, yeah, that there is a language barrier too. And I know one of the things that we're working on, we've got a high ESL population here. We've got 50% Mennonite population here in kindergarten, up to about 16% in grade 8. So more and more kids whose first language is Pennsylvania Dutch and who come to school not speaking English. And one of the things that we're doing more of is allowing the students to speak in their own language when they're solving the problem, and then so they don't have to worry about the translation back and forth, and then being able to explain it in English once they've had a chance to work through the math. Of course, that won't work if you have some students who don't have anyone else that speaks their language, but it's one of the strategies we're using. Okay, so I just want to talk about a couple of things and then we'll have a chance for some more comments. Again, please keep them coming as you're going, and I'll try and look at both of them. Some of the things that we create as a group in my classes are some anchor charts using the kids' representations of different ways of solving the problems, so that we maybe have some kids that do that linear measurement and some kids who use sets and draw. And if you're not sure what these are, I'm going to show you in a minute where you can learn about these different fraction models. So the area model being like taking this square that's on the top right-hand corner and just dividing the area up into equal parts, versus a linear model where you're dividing that into equal parts, into quarters. If I can do that quickly. Versus the set where you've got actual items. I can't do this very quickly. And then you're imagine those are equally sized, okay? And you're dividing that into 4 equal parts, okay? There's a lot of strategies we talk about, and we put some of our strategies for justifying their answers, like they use logical reasoning, like, okay, well there's 2 cars that have 3 subs and different number of people, so they can't possibly, if you divide them up equally, you can't possibly have the same number, same size of piece. We put up samples of the kids using benchmark fractions, so saying, well, this car has more than a half, this car just has a half, therefore it's not fair, those sorts of things. And then using the mathematical language like numerator and denominator correctly. We put those samples up as a student work, and that's where I find I use, you know, let the students teach each other rather than me making up a beautiful anchor chart to show them. I like that idea Bella just gave, who collected choices for group mates, as well as when they had a problem with one on the other side, they had to provide a reason for both. Awesome starting point. That's a good idea. And Angela's put up there math dictionary for kids. That's great. Okay, so a set of resources that I've come across that help me to know how to respond to student work and to see more clearly the actual fractions work that kids are doing. Because you could give that problem with the subs to students. They could do work, and if it doesn't look like you're expecting, I know that in the past, you know, before I really learned to look at it in more detail and see different ways of doing it, I wouldn't have necessarily seen that their math was a good way of doing it. And so it took me taking a look at Kathy Fosno's samples online, and had a book in my school by Van de Waal, and I don't have the title for that, but you can look him up, that shows basically a lot of ways of looking at, you know, fractions and all the different concepts in math. I looked at the guides to effective instruction, especially the front bit of those, and actually read through rather than just looking for the problems. And they really show you the different ways of representing fractions. Okay, and another excellent book is this Making Math Meaningful to Canadian Students by Marion Small. That's been, I have it open in front of me, there's stickies everywhere, little notes, and it's a beautiful resource for dipping in and out of because there's tips, there's examples, it shows you all the ways, manipulatives you can use. And Bella's talking about the front bit of the Guide to Effective Instruction. If you look at those books, and they're available online as well, the back bit has questions you can do with your students. Okay, so I'm looking through this one on fractions, and it's got tangram activities and number strips and all sorts of really good problems like the Cassie Fosno one that you can use. But the front bit actually goes through and tells you how students might model, or you might model, fractions as part of a whole. It takes you into different ways of counting fractional parts. It's got all sorts of ways of establishing a whole part relationship, the fact that 1/4 is just part of this whole. Okay, so I can see lots of people have used these resources, which is excellent. The one thing I like about the Making Math Meaningful is that, it's a big, expensive textbook kind of thing, so you might want to get your school to buy it, but it's got lots of tips that are really quick, so you can really get something to work on that's really rich and meaningful quickly, but then it's got all the background to the thinking behind the math. Another section, it talks about misconceptions. So common ways that students have issues and why. So they might just have that misconception about the whole always staying the same sort of thing. And I'm going to come up with another example of a misconception in a minute on another slide. So those are just some of the resources. And I know, yep, somebody said, I've heard of a lot of faculties that are using the Marion Small book as a textbook, which I think is great. It's a great resource if you do end up buying it. And Louise has put all the links there to those 4 things. Here's what the books look like. Now, Marion Small has a lot of different books, which is great, but I really like this one big textbook. I think it's very, very useful. The purple book on the bottom is my go-to one for problems, because it gives you some really good context to it. Sometimes the Marion Small and the smaller books, there's a lot of hers out in schools this way. I'm not finding a lot of questions I can use, but the purple one here, Good Questions for Math Teaching, it's a 5 to 8 book, and then there's a light purple one that's K to 6. Somebody just bought that, great. And there's some other, that Good Questions one is really good. That's the one that's up there, fabulous. So those are just some of the resources. Yes, it is expensive, Angela, so get your school to buy it if you can. I think I got mine for more like $80 though, so you might want to look around and see if you can find it somewhere else. So I talked about some jumping off points, and if you take a look at the question, is it fair, and you can come up with a lot of questions that it kind of can come from that same question and be at a different level for fractions. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. Mr. Volker happens to be our principal, and I've done a lot of questions with him. But imagine him handing out markers to the teachers, and different teachers get a different amount. And the question is it fair? And the kids have to actually justify why or why not. Now, this is a really simple example, but I gave this one to start with because some of the kids with this kind of question say, yeah, it's fair. And the reason why they say that is, well, Miss Griffin is always using markers, so she needs a lot of them. And Mr. Clark hardly ever uses them. So really, it would be wasteful if Mr. Volker gave him more than a half a pack. Okay? So there's lots of ways you can answer, and just being fair doesn't mean equal, right? So, but this is just a sample of what you might do with a kind of question. And Louise will be emailing all these links in and have them available on a website that she'll a page that she'll set up. Okay. So if you imagine making this a little bit more difficult here. So Mr. Volker hands out the markers, and Mr. Clark gets a half, Mrs. Smits gets 3/4, Miss Griffin gets a whole pack, Mr. Dawson gets 3/5 of a pack, Mr. Hammond gets 1/4 of a pack. And you could Yeah, Bella says, fair is not always equal. Exactly. But you could get them to order them from who gets the least to who gets the most, right? And we've all used, probably if you've taught fractions, you've used questions like this before. And you can make it more difficult or more easier depending on the grade level. So for grade 4s, where they're comparing fractions with like the same denominator, you know, you could do something like that and have them order it. But you can also do something a little bit more open where they can come up with some different kinds of answers. So you could say, using some benchmarks, some numbers that they know and are familiar with, like 0 and 1/2. You could say Mr. Clark has the closest to 0. Mrs. Smith has over half, etc., etc. And then they have to order them from smallest to biggest and maybe comment on whether this was fair or not. So that's some ways you can take some questions like this, sort of like the subway problem, and kind of change them about. Now I'm going to put you guys to work, and I want you to try and list what are some of the manipulatives you have found most useful, or that maybe that you haven't used but you'd kind of like to explore on here, because there's all sorts of them. So just add them up on the white screen, or you can add them to your chat box. Obviously you can use the actual objects. You can use a number line. Somebody's put Lego up there. What are some of the other manipulatives? Goodbye, Bella. Nice to see you here. Pizza. Thanks, Rachel. I think a lot of, like when I first started teaching, certainly fraction strips were something I went to right away. And one of the things I had frustration with was that, you know, they weren't as useful for some of the kids if they were cutting them up themselves, and there were some kids that couldn't cut very well. And what we started to do was put laminated, like in the back of many of these resources, especially in the back of the Guide to Effective Instruction, they have the black line masters for fraction circles, for number lines, for fraction strips. And as a group, we made little booklets of those sheets in the plastic pocket protectors, and then the kids can use them again and again using the erasable markers. We found that's a way for them to quickly be able to get to use a manipulative without wasting a lot of paper, or without having to do the cutting as much. I think the fraction strips are great for them, especially when you get to maybe adding some fractions to in grade 7 and 8. So there's lots of different manipulatives out there. One of the ones that I still don't understand how to use as well as the Cuisinart rods. I don't find them as good for the kids' problem solving specific, like general problems. They're really good for problems that are designed for the Cuisinart rods. Now that just may be me, and I don't quite get them yet, but that's something I'm working on. I love the dice there. I use dice a lot for things, and those are really useful for games and things. There's that's okay. There's a really good fraction dice game in the Effective Guide to Instruction if you're interested in taking a look at that. Geoboards are great. And Lori talked about the circular shape is not the easiest, and we've kind of gone to the rule that they can use circles, but they have to use the ones that we've printed up for them because, as you said, they're not very good at drawing them. And really the photocopied and then laminated or put in pocket protector versions are reusable and work really well, so they can tell the size. Okay, so we're getting to the end of the session here, and I got a couple more pages, so I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of visualization. And yes, for circles, definitely they have to be fairly divided. So there's a few resources that have used number lines like this for visualizing, and I find these are great ways of activating the students' knowledge, of getting their minds on in the beginning of a lesson, and just saying, okay, trying to put a line that's not quite at a benchmark fraction. So that question mark is not quite at 2/3, and it's not quite at 3/4. And just having the kids kind of try to justify what they think that fraction is and why. This is a great activity for a smartboard, and the kids can have, you can also demonstrate a variety of ways of answering it, and the kids can come up and divide it in different ways to show and to justify. It's also a great kind of question for proportional reasoning, because you could have fractions on the bottom and do decimals on the top, or percentages and fractions, so that they're comparing different ways of showing an amount. Another way of doing it is with a shape, an area model. So having the kids come up and say, okay, what fraction do you think that yellow section is? And I'm wondering if there's somebody who would like to put their hand up that would like to try and divide this up and show us what you think this fraction might be. And while somebody's dividing that, maybe other people could kind of put their estimates around it, or like on the white part, or in the chat box. So whoever started with that line, if you want to keep going, dividing it up, can you show us what you're thinking? So that would be 1/1/4. And we can see that that's right away one of the ways I hadn't really thought of doing it. So is there somebody else, maybe Louise, do you mind erasing that line for us? And is there somebody else who wants to try and divide it up a different way? Do you see this a different way? And can you tell us what you think it might be? Don't worry about the hand up if you want to just jump in. I like that. I don't even want my brain to work on 2/3 times 1/2 right now. It's too late at night. But we got some other ways of doing it. I think I tend to divide it up different ways depending on the day sometimes. So there's all sorts of ways of interacting with this. Somebody else has got 1/3 for 1/3. And I'm thinking I can see 1/3 if you've got 3 parts, but if there's 4 parts there, maybe it would be 1/4 for that. Oh, I see, okay. Right. Okay. So people are thinking 1/3 are thinking that the top bit and the bottom bit go together to make the third. Good. Okay. So the next sheet, I want to show you just a quick problem here that deals with a misconception. So take a minute to read this and see if you can get your own answer in the chat box or on the white page. I just noticed my typo and tried to correct it by putting a little S on the marbles. Sorry, that was a typo, Vicki. So you guys are going right away, as Jennifer said. Kids might not see right away that you need to know how many marbles that Sally and Akash have in their set to begin with before you can compare them. And a lot of the kids go right away to having 2 wholes that are the same and dividing them into half and quarters, and they can say, yeah, Akash has more than Sally. And they could be right. They could be very much right, but you have to know how many they started with. And often with this, the kids become quite creative in coming up with non-examples or examples that show that she isn't right. And they say something like, Sally could have 200 marbles, so she's bringing 50 to school. whereas Akash only has 10, so he's only bringing 5 to school. And so there are quite a few problems out there in these resources that really challenge the kids to think about it. And if we only give examples where we're talking about similar wholes, the kids are going to think that when you're comparing fractions, it's always starting with the same set or the same whole. Okay, so just in wrapping up, some of the things that I see as really important in my own learning is the idea that fractions can be seen as equal sharing, and we can talk about fairness, and that it's really, really important for kids to be able to visualize and represent fractions as equal portions, a whole divided up into equal portions. And I've started using a lot more contexts that involve equal sharing or fairness as a result. It's really important to educate yourself on the kinds of different ways kids can represent fractions or represent their works, the strategies they use, so that you can see in their work and give them the time to explain their work so you can see the math that's there. Because I find that my kids often have a lot of different strategies I've never even thought of. Their justification can come in many forms. And so just because the kids don't answer all the question, they maybe came up with a shortcut, that's okay, as long as they can justify it. I've learned that I can learn a lot more from my students and with my students than when I'm trying to just deliver the information. And the biggest point for me is that when I engage my students in action research about their own practice as learners, after showing them how I'm trying to improve my learning, it comes up with this much more open classroom environment where we're all seeing each other as you know, teachers and learners and trying to just improve. So my intentions today were to kind of model some use of reflection in teaching, to try and get some of your thoughts incorporated, use your student voice and show you how I use my own student voice when I'm teaching, to talk a little bit about action research, and give you some jumping off ideas and some resources to go with those, and hopefully create an authentic and safe environment for it to be not as fearful as some of you might think in joining an online learning community. And I'm wondering if you are able to give me some feedback on whether I've been able to do that effectively, or what I might improve if I were to do this kind of thing again. And I've got a page here where you can maybe add your own comments. And while you're doing that, Louise is going to do a wrap-up, I think, for us. But really think about, can you give me some feedback, and in a feedback sheet that Louise is going to talk to you about, because I can't improve my practice without feedback from you.
I'm just going to say, Syria, over to you.
Thank you, Louise. And thank you so much, Kathy, for definitely tackling and being fearless when dealing with fractions. You discussed many challenges that students face with fractions, and certainly offered effective ideas, strategies, and resources to help students to get a better understanding and achieve that comfort level when dealing with fractions. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank each of you to join us tonight and participating in the webinar. You've contributed to your ideas in both the chat boxes and the whiteboard, so that was wonderful to see the collaboration here. I certainly hope you will be able to use some of Kathy's ideas in your math classes. Remember that Louise will be sending the link or an email to you probably tomorrow morning with the resources and links and more information. Do take a few minutes. Kathy has asked you to give her feedback here on the whiteboard, which is great. Please do that for her so that she can get the visual immediately. But I would ask that before you leave the session, you do click on the link that Louise will put in the final page that asks you for your feedback to tonight's session, as a whole. So Kathy's presentation, in addition to the use of the technology, for many of you, this was your first session with OTF Connect. So how was that experience for you? Your feedback is really important to us, and we do use it to shape our program and to improve our program as we go along. Oh, thank you, Louise. The slide is there, and the link in the middle is your feedback survey. So we'd really appreciate it if you could give us that feedback. Also, at the bottom of the screen is the link to upcoming sessions. Use it, please, to sign up for more sessions that are math session, technology sessions that are on the calendar from now till May. We will eventually have webinars that are scheduled right up to the first and second week in June. Do share the link with your colleagues and encourage them to join us so we have more participants with OTF Connect. I'd like to thank Louise for all the work that she does to make the workshops always run very smoothly. Thank you all again. Thank you, Kathy. Have a good night and stay warm. I understand it's going to be really cold again tonight. So thank you and good night, and hope to see you all again.